Sci Access, May 11, 2024. The True Barriers to STEM. Dr. Sharon McLennon Wier, Molly Senack.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Sharon McLennon Wier. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Independence of the Disabled, New York, Sydney. Visual description of me: I am a Black woman. I'm 53 years old. I'm also a totally blind person. I have blue eyes and blonde hair, and I'm sitting home in my home office. My background is pink, and I'm wearing a rust blazer. And I would like to introduce Molly Senack. Molly?
Hi, I'm Molly Senack. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman who is 32 years old with long brown hair and dark brown eyes. I'm just sitting in front of a blank white background, and I am going to start sharing my screen now so that everyone can see our PowerPoint.
And just full disclosure, you guys will hear a robotic voice. This is Dr. Wier. I am a totally blind person, and that's JAWS for Windows that is speaking, letting me know what's happening on the screen. So don't freak out, no gremlins, just screen reading technology. Molly?
All right, perfect. So a little bit about Sydney, the Center for Independence of the Disabled, New York. Or Sydney, our goal is to ensure the full integration, independence, and equal opportunity for all people with disabilities by removing barriers to the social, economic, cultural, and civic life of the community. And today we are going to be talking about how to do that specifically when it comes to careers in STEM for blind or low vision people when it comes to screen reading technology. And I am going to pass to my colleague, Dr. Wier, as we talk about data analytics in STEM careers.
Thank you, Molly. So we put this presentation together because we understand that careers should be open to each and every individual that have the desire to pursue it. Unfortunately, STEM for people with disabilities, especially for those of us that are blind and visually impaired, is not always the first subject matter that we talk about. I had a visual impairment since the age of 6, so I grew up not being able to see and very much like science. So some of this conversation will be discussed based on personal experience, but also working in the field of disability for the last 27 years, we recognize that people with disabilities, the STEM field is not always a first option. So we would like to demystify that and change that. So why is it important for us to understand statistics and data? As you know, with STEM and also the social sciences, what we do is we spend a lot of time conducting research. And in order to conduct research, we need an avenue or way to analyze research. And a lot of the times we use different types of statistical packages, different statistical programs to analyze the data that we collect. So within social sciences, there are several avenues of statistical analysis that we can use depending on the type of data research we're trying to look at. May it be categorical variables or continuous variables. We need to figure out, do we do univariate statistics or do we do multivariate statistics? In doing that, SPSS, which is very popular for social science research, but that's going to allow you to be able to analyze univariate statistics. If you need to do more multivariate statistics, there are programs like LISREL or AMOS that can help you in executing that data. One of the things I found in working on research, especially during the dissertation process and post-dissertation, is that some of these statistical programs do not work with screen reading technology. So it makes it really arduous for an independent researcher that may have visual problems to actually run the analysis and being able to read what the output is. And this is why we're here to talk to you about it today. Molly?
All right, so there are several laws in place that were enacted in order to protect accessibility. The first and most famous one, obviously, is going to be the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADAA, of 1990. And that is civil rights legislation that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. Specifically, it protects people with disabilities from being discriminated against in employment, transportation, any access to government programs or services, and most importantly, and kind of most famously, public accommodations. Then the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 expanded the definition of disability in order to protect more people against discrimination. Then we have sections 504 and 508, both of which refer to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504, again, these are still anti-discrimination laws. Section 504 refers to protecting the rights of people with disabilities in education and employment. You cannot be excluded from participation in these things based on your disability. And section 508 specifically refers to technology. It says that technology has to be accessible under federal law, basically. And then below here, you see the web content accessibility guidelines. These are the guidelines that things like the ADA use when they are looking at whether or not technology is considered accessible under the ADA. And there are several different classifications that you can get in terms of web content accessibility. Most of them refer to things like, is that technology available for screen readers? What is the contrast like? Do they include audio descriptions? Are there ASL interpreters available for any videos that are being streamed? Is how many things on the site are available just through keyboard navigation? Are text resizers available on the site? And those things that I just listed are what are the criteria used to those are the standards for the greatest accessibility. Those are the AAA standards. Most websites do not fall under those categories, and they can still be considered ADA compliant. Which brings us to continued barriers for screen reader technology. Despite all of that legislation saying that this software, these programs that Dr. Wier had mentioned in the beginning, despite saying that under the law, you are entitled to access that information, that is not always the case. Screen reading and magnification technology are not necessarily available for all of these data analytics software that are vital in a participation in a career in STEM or even an education in STEM. So for instance, just with what Dr. Sharon was talking about, just with SPSS, which, as Dr. Wier had said, was one of the most important, most widely used programs when it comes to education and careers in STEM. The information on how to use screen reader and magnification technology is not widely reported. It is very difficult to find. Not only that, the access to screen reading technology is incredibly limited with these programs. They are not necessarily available for every program. They are not necessarily available with LISREL. They are not necessarily available with AMOS. They are not necessarily available with SPSS. And what that means is you might be attempting to enter data into these sites. You might be attempted to enter the data that you have collected. You may be attempting to analyze the data that you have collected, only to discover that the supposed accessibility tools that allow you to use your personal screen reader software is not available, is not compatible with these programs until you add on additional software. You might also discover that different accessibility tools are required at every stage of the program that you are using. For instance, there might be a different process for accessibility when it comes to entering the data, and another an entirely different process when it comes to reading it back to you. These are also not necessarily compatible with updates. A lot of the screen reader technology that, again, these programs, which are very famous, SPSS, is owned by IBM. And IBM has targeted a lot of these accessibility tools towards older Windows models, which means that as you update your software, which is, as we know, necessary in technology, you are going to discover that after all the work you have put in to ensure that your, for instance, JAWS screen reader is working with the software programs you are using. Once you update the program, the software is no longer compatible. Additionally, a lot of the screen reader technology that, again, is supposedly accessible as is legally required, actually causes the systems to crash and is not actually accessible. Additionally, the information on accessibility is very difficult to find, not just difficult to the point of impossible, not only for users, but also for educators and even for computer administrators who might be helping, who might be helping a user with a visual impairment access the screen reading technology.
So Molly, let me just jump in for impact. I think you covered that. So essentially what we're talking about here is a person who's using screen reading technology, especially if they're using JAWS for Windows. The fact of the matter is it's based on a lot of memory keystrokes. So you may know a set of keystrokes that can help you navigate one version. And then to do an update, they may change things, and the previous keystrokes that you once knew may no longer work. So it's important that if manufacturers are going to become compliant, excuse me, and do updates, that they really need to also have a navigation pane that says what the various keystrokes are for this new version, so that someone who's using JAWS for Windows will know exactly what keystrokes to use. It's also important to understand that the impact is great as someone who's trying to, navigate and learn science. You want to get into the STEM, you want to be successful, and now it's almost a double whammy. You have to figure out the actual content area within your discipline. And also now you have to consider how to access that discipline, which makes it even further harder for that individual to really, grasp the information and be able to utilize what he or she have learned within their content area. So just to continue on talking about further impact, to get through, there's always a workaround that a person with a disability who uses screen reading technology has to incorporate. Let's say that the actual analyses can't be done by yourself independently. Well, you're going to then have to find someone to help you get it done, because you want to complete your studies, you want to complete your research, you want to be a researcher, so you may need to then figure out extra costs in hiring people to help you collect data or input data into the various systems. Also, figuring out how to interpret the input of the data. Some of these higher level data programs, such as AMOS and LISREL, will give you sometimes pictorial depictions of what the actual data is saying. So you'll get a lot of graphics, you'll get a lot of diagrams. And as a blind person, visually impaired person, you may not be able to understand that because it's in picture form. So now you have to figure out another workaround. Molly?
Yes, so that also goes into why there is so much discouragement for young students who are blind or visually impaired from entering careers in STEM. The discouragement begins very early on, even in primary and secondary school, because so many of the tools needed are geared towards using the sense of sight. And what that means is that a lot of times that discouragement comes from an implicit place where there's simply a lack of available resources, a lack of textbooks, a lack of graphics that utilizes senses other than sight, and again, a lack of available software provided for students who are interested in pursuing an education or a future career in STEM, but also there is an explicit exclusion that often occurs because many educators who are not well versed in accessibility measures will go the route of just saying to a student that they are unable to participate. And Dr. Wier, if you would like to talk at all about that.
Yes.
About that particular impact.
Right. So the impact of intersectionality, I think we really want to highlight in this presentation. STEM for people of color in general is not something that's heavily advertised. And if you are further have a disability as well as being a person of color and also being a female, the chances of you getting into STEM is quite hard. So we want people who are interested in STEM that also have the intersectionality of race, gender, and disability and other diverse traits to be hopeful that it can be done. But you're going to have to work really hard, and you're going to have to really get the resources that you need in order to get it done. I personally can tell you that science was something that I really liked from the very beginning of school when I had my visual loss. And I did not see a talking or didn't feel or hear a talking computer until the 90s. And I started school in the 70s. Okay. So how do you go about doing that? I mean, in the 80s, the whole idea of computers was really the thought of only sighted people could really use a computer, which was unfortunate. And we've come a long way now, 2024, where we have voiceovers on Apple products, and we have screen reading and magnification technology. You know, we have a lot, but even with that, these software programs still need to interact with the mainstream programs that we described in other programs that you will see in higher education. So how do we get the owners of software products to understand that when they're building these various statistical programs, that they have to consider all users and not necessarily have a bias that certain types of fields or certain types of even videos is only going to be used by someone who's sighted. So intersectionality is a big problem. And we recognize that having other mentors that actually have gone through the process is something that everyone needs, regardless of what your disability, race, or gender is. If you think about it, when you first thought about what you wanted to do when you were growing up, you probably saw someone in that role. Could be your mother, your father, it could be a relative, it could be a neighbor or a friend, or even someone at your local religious institution, and you thought, wow, I would like to do that. Can I do that? So having mentor programs within organizations like Sydney, where you can come and see people with disabilities engaging in all different types of tasks, is also something helpful for someone who is disabled and also interested in pursuing higher education and pursuing a career in STEM. Molly?
Yes, and just to add to that, in terms of having mentors and educators who really understand disability, there is so much room for creativity when it comes to STEM. And something that is so important is being able to think creatively when it comes to accessibility. So for instance, some alternative solutions outside of the software aspect to really encourage students with disabilities to be able to really be able to process this information that is typically only presented in a visual format, is so important for educators. So for instance, the use of the sound and feels data module, where the goal is to convert visual signals. So for instance, when we're looking at graphs, you could be using a change of pitch to indicate points on a graph. You could be using tactile graphs. Graphs. And for instance, Dr. Wier, I think you had an interesting example. Yeah.
Yes. So when I was an undergraduate, I attended Syracuse University. I was a biology major, and I had a specific concentration was microbiology. And I did the whole pre-med cycle of organic chemistry and physics and biochem. And I remember that my tutor in organic chemistry was really trying to get me as a blind person to understand what benzene looked like. Of course, benzene is a chemical compound with a lot of carbons and a lot of oxygen. So what he did, he actually made me a tactile model using felt and using styrofoam. And the felt lines were the connections, and the styrofoam, based on where they are, represented oxygens and carbons. And it was really cool to finally get it, because, the books would read it, and he would say it, but it's something that you really needed to grasp in your hand. So what he did was actually made a model that I could feel, so that I could understand in my hand what people were actually seeing on the page. And I think as educators, we have to really get creative in how we portray information. So, 3D information, tactile information, verbal information. Do you guys realize that only 50% of our knowledge is coming through our eyes? So what about the other 50% that we're losing? So as educators, it's important for us to try to use universal design, including using all 5 senses, including the 2 additional sense, which includes balance and connectivity, to kind of help people understand more dimensionally how to process information. Molly?
And I'm just going to go really quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for questions, and because Dr. Wier, I think, already covered it really beautifully. Once we get to the component of STEM where data analysis is needed, it is so important to also make sure that those programs are accessible for people in a non-visual capacity. And that includes software improvements for these especially big brand, widely used data analytics programs. The accessibility of information just needs to be better so that people are not struggling to find instructions on how to actually utilize that accessibility software and not discovering that they need add-ons after they have already begun. They need to comply with the accessibility legislation that has already been enacted, and they need to prioritize keeping assistive technology up to date so that as you update your software, you are not suddenly discovering that everything that you have taken all of this time to learn is suddenly no longer relevant. And in order to do this, there is a huge demystification that needs to happen. There needs to be an attitudinal shift from educators who believe that people with disabilities cannot fully participate in STEM, and they need to actually start encouraging their students to, again, think outside the box when it comes to how to present certain information. And there needs to be better outreach from these tech companies so that they are actually marketing to people who need to use their accessibility tools, so that we are not trapped in a loop of tech companies believing they don't need to utilize accessibility software because they don't have enough potential users, which in turn makes it so there aren't enough potential users because they don't know that there's accessibility technology available. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can start.
I just want to add one thing too.
Yes,
I think all of this can only work if the individual actually understands their preconceived notions and bias. So if you are someone who is working in science, and maybe you come across a person with a disability, you may think, there's absolutely no way this person can do that. And maybe that's coming from the perspective of maybe you're thinking that you couldn't do it. And I think a lot of the times when people say, no way, this person can't do it, a lot of it is said based on fear. I think about many, many people who have said to me over the course of my career, from the undergraduate level right through the doctoral level, that a blind person cannot be a psychologist, they can't do research, they can't do this, they can't do science. And, sometimes you got to prove them wrong, but also you have to keep trying. I don't want people to feel as if one or two people, or even 100 people say to you that you can't do it, then you just give up. There's always a resource or an organization that can give you resources, because not everybody knows. And sometimes we just can't admit that we don't know. All right, any questions?
Thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation. If anyone would like to submit questions at this time, you can do so via the Q&A, which is available either in the bar at the bottom of your screen or at the top, depending on what device you are on.
There were some comments that came in my screen reader. I had to cut it off. So I don't know if you want to read some of those comments or.
Yeah, I can absolutely read some of those.
Okay.
So we had someone who said that some of these have a statistics program option to add a caption to your figure, but because the output figure is often formatted as an image file, the output is not screen reader friendly unless the figure caption is added separate from the figure onto the manuscript or research document.
Mm-hmm.
There was another comment that said, people don't even seem to understand the difference between the figure caption and the alternative text that is intended to describe the figure visual description.
Mm-hmm.
There was
I agree. I agree.
There was someone that asked, was this work done before molecule kits?
I had a molecule kit. So the molecule kit wasn't enough. So, and I should just tell people that I'm 53. So I went undergraduate years was 89 and 93. So things were primitive back then. There's a lot more. The molecule kits that I had is nothing like what you guys have now. So.
And pardon me, we also have two questions
Okay.
through the Q&A function. One is, does Sydney have any STEM specific programs? And another is identifying specific groups working in the STEM blind space who might be available as a resource. And I think those two might be tied together.
Well, those are good questions. No, Sydney does not have any specific STEM programs. What we do offer is a myriad of programs to help people with disabilities and pursue whatever they want to pursue. And also having a space where you're around other people with disabilities doing all different types of occupations. So it's more of a resource. It's more as a social support. And if anybody wants to work with Sydney on having resources for STEM, we would be more than happy to do that. I think me being a blind person coming into Sydney with my academic background and experience in research can also add to it, because I've had a lot of personal experience on many folks saying this cannot be done. So, and we know that it can be, it just may take a person a little bit longer, and we just may have to retrofix something that is not standard.
And as for blind support groups,
what was it? Blind support groups?
Blind support groups for
Okay.
careers in STEM.
Yes. So there are a lot of different blind support groups, believe it or not, through a lot of the blind organizations throughout the city. Helen Keller, Lighthouse Guild. So if someone needs any resources, they can definitely email me and I can hook you up with somebody. It's important. There's actually just to let you guys know how I found out that things could be possible. In 1989, there was actually a book on different occupations that people with disabilities were in. And I learned of a Dr. David Hartman. I'm not sure if he's still alive right now, but he was the first blind person to go to Temple University's medical school and receive his MD degree. So I got to meet him. and talk about what medical school was like and his story, his journey. So there are, and now with Google itself, you guys could just look up people and find people rather easily. And sometimes it just takes sending an email to someone saying, "Hey, I just want to know your story because I have this particular disability and I'm thinking about this, and I know you're in this field, and can you tell me how you did it?" That's what we talk about, these mentoring programs, because they do help.
SciAccess. Learn more at www.sciaccess.org.